Now, for this next section, we're going to start talking about some social cognitive theories of personality. So far in the chapter, we've focused on internal factors that are driving our personality, whether that be our conscious mind or our unconscious, or even just our biology. But these social cognitive theories are going to argue for the idea that behavior is not explained by just external or just internal factors alone. There's going to be more to it. And if you remember back again to Psych 104, we're going to start seeing a lot of overlap with the psychology of learning. And a lot of these theories are going to look at the idea of our personality being not just due to our internal or external factors, but also due to the things that we have learned from previous experience. So our learner, the person who is exhibiting different personality traits, is not simply a passive reactor to their environment or simply a conduit for their internal drives. Instead, this cognitive side of things is going to look at humans as a perceiver, a thinker, and a planner who's going to mentally interpret the things that we're encountering in our environment, compare that to things we've experienced and learned about in the past, and make a conscious decision on how to act in the present. So social cognitive theorists like Albert Bandura would believe in the idea of reciprocal determinism. And this reciprocal determinism is basically the idea that the individual, their behavior, and their environment are all linked and influenced in a pattern of two-way causal links, which is a lot easier to visualize when we look at the image that accompanies it. So we have this individual, so their individual personality characteristics, their cognitive processes, and their self-regulation skills. And there's this two-way interaction between that individual and their environment. And their environment can include stimuli from social or physical environment. So coming from other people or physical things within the environment. We also have reinforcement contingencies, things related to learning, things that you've learned in the past. And again, more two-way interactions down here to lead to behavior. So the type of behavior that you see, the frequency that you see that behavior occurring, and the intensity in which you see that behavior. Julian Roeder focused on the behavior side of this triangle here. And they said that our behavior is governed by two specific factors, our expectancy and the reinforcement value. So again, from last time you took a intro psych course back in Psych 104, you might have learned about the expectancy by reinforcement theory. This is a very similar idea based on the same concepts, where expectancy is your perception of how likely it is that a certain consequence will occur if you engage in a particular behavior. And reinforcement is going to be how much you actually want or dread the consequences. So if you really, really want to do well in school, if you are the kind of person that highly values getting a good grade, you have a very strong reinforcement value for getting a good grade, and you expect that studying is going to lead you to get a better grade in a particular class, then you are a lot more likely to follow that act, to do the behavior of studying. Whereas if you're someone who doesn't value a good grade or doesn't think that studying is going to help you, maybe it's a class and it's too hard for you, there's no way you're going to wrap your mind around it, I'll never do well in this class, then you're a lot less likely to do the behavior. You're a lot less likely to actually study. So by looking at our expectancy, whether we think studying will help or not, and our reinforcement, how much we want that good grade, we can determine how likely people are to enact a certain behavior. Now, that whole idea isn't any different than what you would have learned in 104 in terms of expectancy by reinforcement theory. Where it starts differing is where we introduce the idea of the locus of control, or specifically Roeder's internal external locus of control. And this is a generalized expectancy concerning the degree of personal control we have in our lives. Basically, someone can figure that they have a lot of personal control over their lives, or maybe someone feels that they have very little control over their lives. So if you have more of an internal locus of control, you assume that you take charge, you determine what happens in your life, and your own actions have a very strong influence on your environment. Whereas if you have more of an external locus of control, you're going to believe more in luck or chance or the power of others, where you assume that your own actions have little consequence and it's more to do with what's going on in the world. You might say that if it's going to happen, it's meant to be, if you follow this external locus of control idea. Whereas someone who has an internal locus of control would say, if it's meant to be, I'm going to make it happen by working for it. And so a lot of research has shown that people with that internal locus of control are a lot more likely to take an active role in different aspects of their lives. They're more likely to go to protests, try and affect active social change. They would feel that their individual actions have the potential to influence the world. And so the way that you're framing or looking at the world, the way that you think your actions can or can't affect the world at large, can have a massive impact on how you behave. People with that internal locus feel very self-determined. They feel like they can have an influence, they can have an impact, so they can seek out their own information, they can actively become involved in situations, and they have a sense of personal effectiveness. They feel that what they're doing matters. People with an external locus are a lot more easy to give in to peer pressure. So if they're being pushed to do something, they might think, well, I might as well. They might give up their power to others in a more powerful position. So I have no control here. I'll let someone who matters make these important decisions. Now we're going to swing back to Albert Bandura, who coincidentally happens to be a Canadian, and specifically a Canadian from Alberta. But we're not just talking about him because he's Canadian and because he's Albertan. He's actually one of the most influential psychologists of the modern era. His theories and ideas have had a dramatic influence on the field of psychology. And his research has dealt with things like social learning, specifically how they apply to aggression, things like moral behavior, and behavioral self-control. So he's a very important person to talk about when we're talking about the socio-cultural effects of personality. So one of the core ideas surrounding Bandura's work, and the thing that made his research different from a lot of other research at the time, is that he was focusing on the idea of human agency. Basically, the idea that humans are active agents in their own lives. When he first started theorizing, a lot of other people were focused on humans behaving in response to their environment only. Not being an active agent, but merely being a direct response to a stimulus in their environment. And so Bandura pushed for this idea that people have the ability to influence their own lives. They are active in this decision to behave in a particular way. So we're not just at the mercy of our environment. We can make our own plans, set goals, and behave in ways that allow us to reach those goals. He argued that human agency is a process, not a particular trait or a characteristic. It's a process that involves 4 individual aspects: intentionality, forethought, self-reactiveness, and self-reflectiveness. So for intentionality, we are planning, we are intentionally doing things, we're modifying our plans and acting with a goal in mind. We're showing forethought where we can anticipate outcomes, set our goals, and actively choose behaviors that are relevant to the goals that we've set. For reactiveness, we're capable of motivating and regulating our own actions. We can modify our goals according to how we're feeling or thinking. We can monitor our progress towards those goals or even change strategies if something isn't working. And in terms of self-reflectiveness, we can think about and evaluate our own motives and values and goals. We can reflect on ourselves. And similar to Roeder's idea of a locus of control, Bandura also had this idea of self-efficacy being really important in how people regulate their lives. So self-efficacy is our beliefs concerning our ability to perform the behaviors needed to achieve a desired outcome. Do we think that our behavior has the potential to do the thing that we want to do? So people who have high self-efficacy are very confident in their ability to do what it takes to overcome an obstacle and achieve their goals. If you have low self-efficacy, you might think that no matter what I do, I'm never going to be good enough. I'm never going to accomplish this. Why even try? And if this self-efficacy is so important in how we go about living our lives, it makes sense that people have spent a lot of time researching what influences self-efficacy. And we have some agreement that there are 4 separate factors that influence our self-efficacy. The first of these and the most important of these is our performance experience. So in other situations similar to this, what has been our previous experience? If we've encountered a situation like this in the past and we have succeeded, we have accomplished our goals, then we're a lot more likely to have high self-efficacy because we've done it before, we can do it again. If you failed in the past, it might make you less likely to think you can do it now because you haven't been able to do it previously. Another factor is observational learning. So if you can observe the behaviors and consequences that other people have used and what has happened in similar situations. So maybe you watch a peer who's trying to solve a problem that you're going to have to solve. What behaviors did they use to try and solve that problem? And were those behaviors successful? If you can observe a model successfully accomplish a task, you might think, oh, well, they could do it, I can do it too. And if you see how they did it, maybe you can model that behavior, maybe you can copy their behavior to accomplish the task. Another factor that influences our self-efficacy is verbal persuasion. If people are encouraging us, telling us that we can do it, we're a lot more likely to believe that we can do it. If people tell us that we can't do it, then we're going to be less likely to think that we can do it because, well, everyone says it's not possible or everyone says I'm not capable, they must be right. And the last factor is emotional arousal. So are you worried about this thing? If you're too nervous of it, it might make you think that you can't do it. Or if you're nervous and you feel like you can overcome that nervousness, that level of arousal might actually help. So if you can overcome your nerves and still approach the task, you might feel more confident than if you hadn't been nervous to begin with. Emotional arousal is a complicated and interactive one. So arousal isn't necessarily good or bad. It's all about how you interpret it and act on it. And so if we want to apply this idea of self-efficacy and the factors influencing our feelings of self-efficacy in order to do better in our lives, if we want to use it to help us setting and accomplishing goals, how do we apply it? So The research tells us that we should try and set specific and measurable goals. Have something where you can define what it means to be successful. So maybe you're trying to study for a class. So your specific and measurable goals might be that you want to study all of your notes before the exam. Maybe you set a specific date that you want to have all your review done by. Or maybe you have a specific grade that you want to get on the test. So I want to get at least a B on this midterm. It also helps if you focus on your performance and not the outcome goals. So maybe instead of a specific grade, maybe you want to focus on feeling calm during a midterm. So if you can feel more comfortable and calm during that midterm, it's going to help you do better on the midterm in the long run, but you're focusing on your performance, on how you're facing it and doing it. We also tend to do better with difficult but realistic goals. So we want to push ourselves just a little bit. If our goals are too simple, we might not even bother trying. But if it's a challenge, and it's an achievable challenge, we can be motivated to push ourselves to achieve those goals. We also tend to do a lot better with positive goals rather than negative goals. So you do better saying, I want to get an A in this course, as opposed to, I don't want to fail this course. Focusing on the positive helps us do better with our goals. And we do a lot better having a mixture of both short and long range goals. If we only have long-term goals, it's really difficult for us to stay focused. If you think of something like losing weight, if you want to lose 20 pounds to get into a healthy BMI, well, it's not good to just say that by the end of the year, well, I guess in a year, because the end of the year is coming up real quick. In a year, I want to have lost 20 pounds. That's a long-term goal, and it's really hard to stay focused on. So maybe you should focus on the short range and say, each month, I would like to lose 1 or 2 pounds, because that's a healthy and attainable short-term goal. And whether it's a short-term or a long-term goal, by setting an actual definitive time span to achieve that goal in, helps us achieve it. If you've ever tried to work on an assignment well before the due date, you might find yourself listless and incapable of concentrating. But as soon as a due date starts looming, as soon as there is that cutoff point, our motivation kicks into gear. So by setting that end point for a particular achievement, we can help with our motivation. So we can use a lot of stuff that we've learned about how our interpretations of self-efficacy work, and we can use it to push and motivate ourselves. Now, our last psychologist that we want to talk about is Walter Mischel. And they did the consistency paradox and looked at if-then behavior consistencies. Mischel was well known because they pushed for a more cognitive approach to personality. They wanted to start taking into account what was going on in people's minds, how people were thinking, and how that influenced their behavior. So again, personality isn't so much a direct response to the environment. Their behavior isn't just a direct response to the environment, but focusing in on that cognitive process, on the mental factors of how we're looking at something from the environment and how that's then becoming our behavior. So focusing on that intermediate step where the mind is acting. And this point of view was really important because of actually a factor that we've talked about already in this chapter. So the official term is this idea of a consistency paradox, which we've discussed as the consistency in behavior tends to be low, where people don't always behave the same way. And for a lot of people, looking at this inconsistency in behavior was starting to make them doubt the idea of solid personality traits. They would say that, well, if our behavior isn't consistent, then maybe personality isn't consistent either. But Mischel argued that it isn't just personality, it's also other external factors. So the behavior that we're observing is actually an interplay between our personality characteristics and the specific situation in which they're acting. And this way of thinking led to the development of the Cognitive Affective Personality System, shortened to CAPS. And this view said that there's a dynamic interplay between our characteristics that a person is bringing to the situation, so their beliefs, their goals, their expectancies, their self-regulatory processes, all of the stuff that this person has and is, and the specific characteristics of the situation. And so the interaction between all of those factors is what's going to account for or help explain the behavior that we observe. So the behavior is going to result from our relatively stable personal dispositions and cognitive affective processes that are interacting with the specific situation that they're in. And so this view proposes what have been referred to as if-then behavior consistencies, which suggests that there's a consistency in behavior, but it's found within similar situations. So we can use the example of if Amy is hungry, then she will be irritable and prone to making rash decisions. So if our if condition changes, then the predicted outcome, the then condition, will change as well. So we can have to consider things like, if this particular condition is met, then we would predict the behavior that we see to follow this particular pattern. But as we change conditions, the observed behavior also changes. So we have to consider both the personality characteristics and the situation to try and predict this behavior. And again, at the end, we can start evaluating these theories, these social cognitive theories of personality. And the good parts are it's an advanced understanding of both internal and external factors. We're looking at a lot more aspects that can relate to personality. We're not just looking at internal, we're not just looking at external, we're starting to look at both and even looking at the interactions between them. And a really cool part is that it's going to start putting some of the insights that we've gained from the other perspectives into these cognitive behavioral concepts. So we're not completely ignoring the things that we've talked about for the other perspectives. We're just putting them into a different framework to explain some of the stuff that maybe wasn't explainable before. So this helps us explain the inconsistencies of behavior, where that instability was leading some people to maybe question the validity of personality, but it helps explain that away. So there's some pretty good aspects of these social cognitive theories that we can start applying.